Welcome to Taking Stock with the Illinois Farm Bureau. I'm Rita, Frazer, some special guests in the studio. Today we're going to take stock of several items, but mostly advocating for agriculture, what battles are being fought out in the industry on behalf of farmers, and helping companies identify opportunities to improve environmental impact at the farm level. Our special guest, Illinois farmer Jill Brokaw. Jill is also the business development specialist with EOC Environmental. Thank you for being here, Jill. And Jenny Webb, who is our associate director of industry affairs at the Illinois Farm Bureau. We have had a couple of different conversations, and so we know that the importance of this conversation is pretty high, not only for today but for the future. So let's start where we mentioned advocating for agriculture. Jill, just because you're closer to me, do you want to start by explaining that? I mean, what does it mean to advocate for agriculture?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Rita. To advocate for agriculture, what does that mean? What does advocacy look like, especially in this space? And I think that when it comes down to it, it's about, defending the importance of farmers, of farming, and of agribusiness. So looking at all those things, and then the advocating part, raising awareness of environmental impacts, and, sharing that accurate information, sharing your story, but telling your story through data and metrics to have those proof points. I think that all of that kind of really sums up advocating for agriculture in a really great way as far as sustainability goes.
I think for me, advocacy is a huge part of my role here at Illinois Farm Bureau. So my goal is to build relationships with food and ag companies on behalf of our farmer members. And so when they are out farming, I can be in Chicago and in St. Louis and at big conferences all across the nation, having conversations with food and ag companies on their behalf and advocating for what they need and kind of what works and what might not. And so that advocacy for me is not as much like on the consumer side, but more talking with these companies and trying to bridge the gap between the farm gate and those decisions that are being made at company level.
And I'm sorry that I didn't put your title in there when we introduced you. So Jenny Webb, did I?
Yeah.
Associate Director of Industry Affairs. Thank goodness, because that is an important a title. And while we're on it, how long have you had this role?
Almost 3 years.
Yeah.
Almost 9 at Illinois Farm Bureau total, but almost 3 in this role, which seems kind of crazy.
Yeah. And as we said, this is really an important time. Everything we talk about today, in some way, shape, or form, makes the headlines. And we're looking at it, we're talking about it. So, all right, so advocating for agriculture, you guys get face-to-face opportunities with these major food companies, restaurants, retailers. And if you can, maybe talk us through environmental, we'll just say accountability of what these companies, what these businesses are looking for today. Jill, you want to start?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what these companies are looking for are folks to really take responsibility for the environmental impacts that they're creating. And when I say take responsibility, I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way, because farming and farmers are responsible for a lot of really great environmental impacts. And that's something that's very important to companies and something that I get to help them see, because that is maybe not the first thing that they think of when they tie what they're doing at the company level back to agriculture. So helping them see how these companies that are looking at sustainability and setting those goals are tying that back to the farm gate and seeing the great things that farmers are doing for agriculture every day and have been doing for decades, and how we continue to do that. I think that's something that's been so impressive to these companies. And when you do talk about that, environmental accountability and environmental sustainability, what those buzzwords actually mean and what they look like from a corporate perspective. And I know that Jenny works a lot in that space as well, really helping connect that together.
I do. So as I talk to different companies, sustainability is something that consistently comes up with corporate goals and really things across the nation where environmental outcomes have come to the forefront. And so we spend some time kind of navigating what all these different words mean, whether that's sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, environmental accountability. There's so many different words floating around. And so we have to kind of make sense of what those all mean and kind of how those trickle down to impact the farm gate.
And just to kind of build on that, and we'll get down to it because I know you've mentioned a couple of acronyms, Jill, in our conversations here. But how are farmers graded, for lack of a better question here? But so they want that data, they want that proof. What kind of bar are they setting, and what kind of data are we looking at?
Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to unpack that. Okay, so when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, when you look at carbon sequestration, all these buzzwords that farmers usually don't even want to hear about or talk about, all these definitions of environmental impacts are really the way farming can tie together with corporate America. So when you look at the goals that are being set, are these targets being set from a company that are looking at SBTI, so science-based target initiatives? And that's a framework that basically shows what your environmental impact should look like as far as from the number perspective and how that impacts climate change around the globe. So they've set these bars, and that's set on, at an international level. But do all of the companies in the United States adhere to that or strive for that? No. Some of them do. And I know we'll kind of get in the weeds on that a little later, but a lot of that is really what do the data and metrics mean, and what do they mean to the farmer? So from a farmer perspective, on my farm, am I looking at, I improved my GHG score? I'm probably not going to put that on a t-shirt next week. But with farming, you're always looking at improvements, environmental improvements, improvements for your livestock, improvements for your farm, improvements for your soil. And unfortunately, these big words have this negative connotation when they really shouldn't. Like, we should really own environmental sustainability in the farming space, because it is all the great work that we're doing in, better herd health, better genetics, better crop genetics, better soil, tillage practices, reductions in tillage, using cover crops, regenerative agriculture, all of these things that we're using to do these improvements that are improvements we might have made without any targets at all being set. So a benefit is that as farmers now, there's a lot of programs where we have companies like the one that I'm currently working for, Eocene Environmental, that are doing that environmental accounting. So taking the information of the farm practices and getting that to a number. So I have a whole team of scientists that work in the background doing all the math and doing all these things. Now, what are those numbers used for? Well, some farmers are using it just to set their own goals and targets and to see a measurable improvement that they can make consistency. Some are using it to set goals for like returns on investments, or looking at, what do investments A, B, and C look like over the next 3 to 5 years if I implement these changes and these practices. And I think it's all of these numbers that are being done in the environmental accounting space are really what are going to give you that bar and watch you move it.
Jenny?
I think the way farmers think about it can even be a little bit simpler too. I hear a lot like farmers are the original environmentalists, and so they're like, we've been taking care of our land for generations. We want this to stay in the family. Something that comes up a lot is the sustainability of just passing through the generations and keeping the farm in the family. And so not just, immediate outcomes, but even, more long-term than that. And so they are looking at, cover cropping, no tilling, reduced tilling, things like that. And all these programs are coming out. And we do have a lot of farmers who have been doing those things for years. And so when some of the programs have come out that have said, this has to be a new practice, they're like, wait a minute, what's in this for me? I've been doing this for generations. We had a farmer that spoke on a panel for us at a conference in Chicago a couple of months ago, and he said that his neighbors, when they first started no-tilling, just looked at him like they were crazy. Like they said, you're too lazy to till your fields. And so, that's what's wrong with you guys. And they had no idea kind of what they were getting into. And so a lot of them were doing this before it was cool. And now, there are some programs and some ways that they can take advantage of maybe some financial incentives and things like that now. But there's still a lot of folks who haven't adopted these practices and maybe are a little unsure. They don't know what the benefits are. There's definitely some risks that go along with them. And so when I hear it from a corporate perspective, I think sometimes I've even heard a company executive say, we can sit in these offices and make decisions about sustainable sourcing. And, why don't farmers do this? Or why don't farmers cover crop all their acres? Why don't they no-till all their acres? But until you get out and you talk to some of those farmers, you can see, what works here might not work a half mile down the road. And so they have to take advantage of their knowledge of the land and exactly, what the soil types are, how things perform to make very specific decisions on their land. So the adoption takes some time, but I think folks are really careful about it too.
And then the adoption process using technology. Has technology and our farmers, access to that technology kept up with the demands in this space, sustainability space? Do they have what they need? Do they have the tools that they need?
Yes and no. I think one of the biggest things is that gathering of data. And so, taking all the different data points that they have on their farm, whether that be their soil, their emissions, their fuel use, things like that, and getting it all into one place. And one of the biggest, maybe complaints that I hear is, there isn't any one platform that can keep track of all of this for me. And the platforms that I do have do not talk to each other. So that data interoperability piece is really something that we think about quite a bit in talking with farmers. A lot of them already have an existing platform that keeps track of their, planting, their hybrids, their yields, things like that. But they're adding in pieces that can keep track of all of these sustainability outcomes too. And so I think we're on the right track. There's a lot of new tech coming out, but I think there's going to be tons more that can make things easier for farmers as well.
I agree. And something that, I was really, as we dive into these questions and thinking about it, is we've had rapid innovation, but uneven implementation. So where we've had all of this growth happening so fast and the priority for farmers changing and evolving so fast that you've got a ton of startups. I'd say 50% of startups that I see right now in ag tech have to do with sustainability, maybe even more than that, but touch that sustainability space. But like Jenny highlighted, a lot of these don't communicate with each other. And the farmer that's farming doesn't have time to cipher through what he should be using, how he should be using it. But I think that that's a sweet spot also where as the farming industry has come along, a lot of these folks have identified that there is a need for programs that coordinate all of this together. So using folks that do that data collection piece, that have a platform that help you integrate that, and then really just have you do a data dump, collect it all, and then give you these reports. I'll highlight the program at National Pork Board. So I worked in that department in sustainability for National Pork Board and helped with that program and that initial rollout. It's amazing because it does highlight all these different groups that have come together to create this program for farmers to where it has a very low lift for them and connects all of it together. Because right now we are needing all of these, bridges and Band-Aids to make all of this data communicate and work together at the ease of the farmer. Yeah.
It's amazing the words that you use, and making that lift easier for farmers is that's awesome. And also having you guys, I think the world of both of you, and I see you out in the industry and I see you talking on behalf of farmers. And I've always wanted you guys, especially, I bug Jenny all the time, but because I think it's great that you guys are out there championing, help me out here.
Championing.
Thank you.
Yes, we are advocating on a regular.
But because of that, it's, you guys, sometimes you're not able to share what you're doing, but you are out there fighting for them. So what are you fighting for? What are the battles being fought out there in that climate for farmers, for agriculture?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, because I do think that something really important to highlight is, in the agriculture industry, there are champions everywhere. And whether you happen to know who they are or see what they're doing, I hope that everyone walks away from this conversation knowing that there are folks out there fighting these battles and fighting these fights and really advocating for farmers and defending their freedoms to operate, and the great things that they are doing and have been doing. So I would say, one of my biggest challenges in my current role are really looking at that company level. And a lot of times you'll have boards at a company level that are setting some of these targets for greenhouse gas reductions, or, they're reducing their environmental footprint. And they look at all the way to that scope 3, to that farm level, to make up that difference. But what they don't understand is that agriculture is so advanced, and we've been working on this for so long. It's not the easy button to go in and say, hey, farmers, create this impact for us, reduce this footprint, because we've been working on footprint reductions our whole lives. We have always been working towards this and striving towards this. So helping a company see a person that might have no experience or tie to agriculture, helping them see what those standards are to a farmer and highlighting the great work we've been doing, and then show them, hey, here's how more impacts can be made, and here's what the farmer needs from you to help them get there. And that is going to be the key, and that is something that is very important, and I know that's something that Jenny works on all the time as well.
For sure. These companies ultimately are going to look for some sort of return on making these changes to their company. They can put a regenerative or a sustainable label on something, or, they can get some marketing pieces from these different programs that they're doing. And so there kind of has to be a shared cost of that throughout the value chain too. It can't just be farmers taking on risk and putting money into these new practices, or maybe investing in new equipment and things like that, without there being some sort of payment throughout the value chain for that too. And that can be kind of a tricky conversation, but there has to be some sort of exchange for the farmers taking on that risk. But I think there can also be a lot of opportunities there to create conversations throughout the value chain, whether that be bringing these companies who are making these decisions out to farms, or bringing farms in to meet with these companies who are making the decisions. That's something that we've been able to do several times, and I always offer when I meet with folks. I'm like, hey, do you want to come to a farm? We've got people right outside of Chicago or right outside of St. Louis that would be glad to host you. And it's really cool to see those come together. We've even brought a venture capital company that's making a ton of investments in food and ag out to a farm. They know agriculture really well. They can talk about it. They speak very well. They just hadn't been to a Midwest row crop farm. And so I'm like, come on out. So we brought them out during harvest. They got to see an organic and a non-organic field right next to each other. They harvested corn and soybeans. They were out there with the farmers, and getting to see them have those experiences and really connect with the farmers and just have those one-on-one conversations, I think can be one of the most impactful experiences that we can provide to kind of help bridge that gap.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, touching on that, paying for economics, a lot of cover crop talk. In all of this discussion, we talk about cover crops, and they have been initiated on many acres here in Illinois, in the Midwest. And there has to be sort of a value. So you guys get questions like, why doesn't every farmer plant them? Why can't every farmer plant those? So can you talk to that a little bit, and is that an easy fix? And, talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So let's first highlight that we are in a time that the USDA has committed more dollars to regenerative and climate smart agriculture than I've ever seen. And I know my parents have ever seen. So this is a really unique time because you are seeing a focus on those incentives. Now, are those incentives enough? Why isn't everyone doing a cover crop? Well, there's a lot of reasons. And the same thing that Jenny highlighted earlier is that not everything works everywhere for everyone. And I know specifically for myself on our family farm, as someone that grew up in a full till, never a cover crop, situation, it was really interesting as I have grown up to see a little bit of a shift in the pattern and the change. But what made it difficult for us personally is we have to get that manure on there. And manure, that's a piece in regenerative agriculture. That's a sustainability piece, a wonderful sustainability story. But it makes it a little more challenging to integrate that with a cover crop. Also, it is a financial commitment. And for a lot of farmers, without having some data and metrics, without having some sort of return on investment prediction or calculation, it's a big commit to go all in on something like that. So a lot of times what you'll see is the beginning steps, right? You'll see a small piece of land that has been committed to cover crops from a farmer. And that's the baby steps. And that's what we're seeing. And I think that's what a lot of these small financial incentives and encouragement and programs are starting to provide is more adoption. But I do think, we have to walk before we run. And farmers are just getting to that point where we are starting to walk in that cover crop space.
Yeah, I think the technical support piece is a big part of it too, because there might be X number of dollars per acre available to plant cover crops doesn't mean that they can just run out there and do it. And so folks have had to make investments in other equipment or maybe hire a neighbor who has the proper, like an air seeder or something like that, to come in and do cover crops. And I guess I'll preface this with I am not an agronomist. I took one agronomy class in college, and that's just enough for me to halfway, understand all of this. But depending on how you do it, sometimes it works the first year and sometimes it doesn't. But there can also be, I talked about that risk, there can be a yield hit, there can be chances of, a ton of rain or not enough rain, altering things. I mean, just like any farming practice. You have to terminate cover crops at a certain time or else they get kind of out of control, and then they might, your yield might suffer from that, or your, future plants can't come up through that. And so I will leave the rest of the technicalities of that up to an agronomist for sure, but just a few of the things that farmers have to think about when they're going to try something new. You don't know exactly what the weather is going to throw at you or anything else. And so it could be a success, and you might say, hey, that worked really well. Let's do that every year. Or I've known a few people who have done it once and they throw in the towel. They're like, never again. My yield was lower. That was a pain. I'm not messing with that again. And so that technical support and folks who can really kind of advise them on proper practices with that can be really important too.
So more research is needed and more time. And some farmers may not have that time. So back to that incentive that you talked about. Okay, USDA has invested over the last couple of years a lot, or earmarked a lot of money for this topic. Now, we know there's some questions when we're talking today. But back to those companies, are they willing to put money towards these efforts? Are they willing to put their money where their mouth is?
Yes and no, I think, is the appropriate response. So when you look at these USDA programs, every one of them has a corporate component to it, because you are needing to stack those incentives and those funds to make it worth doing to a farmer. But I really think that the key takeaway is that as USDA funding got suspended and things are still up in the air, there are very few companies that have said stop. There are very few partners in these programs that have said, hold the phone, we need to backpedal. They're not saying that. They're finding new ways to be more innovative to continue to support farmers.
They are. There's quite a few that have really just dove into this, and they truly want to support the farmers. I think ultimately we have to think about most of these companies, they have to be out for themselves to a certain extent. It can be about their greenhouse gas emissions. It can be about their, net zero by X date goals. And so a component of that is the farm level. And so there are some companies that I think really care about farmer soil health and things like that, and for, the good of our earth and, the future generations of being able to continue to plant these crops. But it can, everybody kind of has to do what works for them too, as far as the companies go. And so, these goals can sometimes be a little bit overcomplicated. I think there's also been some companies that maybe set goals when this became really popular, and then we're like, oh, how are we going to make this happen? And so we've seen a few who have kind of altered their goals or, changed things around a little bit, but a lot of them are really full steam ahead. I mean, some have, metrics on their websites of indicators of how much progress they've made on different goals. And so that's kind of exciting to see the transparency there. And I think one of the frustrations that I think I hear from them is the farmer adoption. We have this program, we think it's going to be great. Why is everyone not doing this? And so we still have a lot of work to do in that place. But these companies, in a lot of cases, are committed, and they really want to invest in agriculture, which is really exciting to see.
Yeah, I completely agree. And with change comes opportunity, right? So the face of what this looks like is in change. It's in flux a little bit right now. But what does that mean as far as opportunities for these companies to continue to create new opportunities, different ways of looking at those regenerative practices for farmers?
Yeah. Now, we reference these companies, and you guys are very trustworthy. You're put into rooms and in situations where you're privy to a lot of information, and we can't mention any companies by name, but we all kind of know if we talk about the big ones out there. I think that's important too, that that farmers know that their products are ending up in stores, in restaurants, in drive-thrus, that they can say, hey, that's my product. Right? There's a lot of that going on. So that's something you guys get to share, at least a little, that's happening out there.
I feel like that there really is a bridge being created in this corporate CPG lane down to the farmer. And the universal language is data. And so even if these folks don't have a tie to agriculture, you can start the conversation with data. But by the time you really get into the conversation, and especially with folks like Jenny or myself in the room, we're not just going to talk about data. They're going to get this sense of pride and really what farming is to a farmer. And to be able to really advocate for that and show that piece, I think is super, super important.
The more we can get farmers in front of these companies, the better, I say. I can go in and tell them something, but we've had cases where I've brought farmers into meetings and then they've been quoted as a big, packaged good company was meeting with Congress. And they say, well, this farmer from Illinois said X, Y, and Z. And it doesn't have quite the same ring to it if they said, well, Jenny Webb said that this Illinois farmer said that such and such. It's not quite as exciting if it comes through me. Now I've tried really hard to listen to our farmers enough over the years that I feel like I can somewhat speak on their behalf in some of these rooms, but I'm careful, to make sure that their views are put in as much as possible. And so we have a farmer that I talked to quite a bit, and I followed up with him on the way home from a meeting one time, and he said, well, what did you tell him today? And so I kind of explained what I had talked about, and he said, well, you're starting to sound like me. That's kind of the same stuff I would have said there. And that was a huge compliment for me, honestly. Like, I was excited that, I could carry forward kind of his views to this meeting that he had to miss. But it's much more impactful the more we can get farmers in front of these folks making decisions. I think I've seen data over the years that farming is one of the most trusted professions in the world. And so the more we can get those farmers who people trust out in front of folks, the more, I think, difference we can make, really.
So are you both optimistic? So you mentioned, like the bridge. So is the gap smaller? Here, we're talking in the spring, almost summer 2025. How big is that gap, and is it getting smaller?
I would say that the gap is shorter than it's ever been, but it's still a very big gap. So when you talk to folks that are not directly tied to agriculture in any way, it is a lift to get them to be able to understand what happens at the farm level. And while I think that, the stories are important, the data is important, it's really all of it tied together that is going to resonate the most and make the most impact to those folks. And I really think that that's going to be what continues to shorten that gap. So, telling your story and proving your story with data and metrics.
I think that gap is a lot of the reason that I have a job. So I, have to be grateful for that. If that completely closed up, there might not be a need for me to go out and, converse between farmers and these companies. But I think we do have a long way to go. I mean, we can look back, 10 or 15 years at different, GMO conversations or cage-free conversations. And so we've been having a lot of these for years where there's just kind of a disconnect between these companies and farmers. But I think the biggest thing right now is that a lot of people are talking about wanting to have these conversations, where really before it was just kind of separated and there wasn't much conversation in the middle. people are wanting to have conversations, they're wanting to learn more, but a lot of times these companies don't have access to farmers. They don't have farmers they can just call up, and so they might reach out to an Illinois Farm Bureau or someone that they feel like they can trust and say, hey, we want to talk to farmers, or we want to learn about X, Y, and Z. And having Jill be a farmer in a role like hers is really important because she has, the boots on the ground experience that you don't often get to talk to. And so that's a unique, scenario also where you can share your knowledge and your experience.
And we may have touched on this, but as we kind of come to a close here, back to what farmers need today. Do they need to have these sustainability goals? Do they need to have that to fit into this space?
I think they all have them already, but I think that the sooner that farmers start advocating for themselves by starting to really compile this data and get some of these baselines done. Baselining is just seeing where you're starting from. And if you're making all these impactful changes, that's great. But if you don't have where you started from, you've got nothing to prove. So you don't have the full story like you would have had if you just start with a baseline. So I would say my takeaway for today is, as farmers are listening to this and hopefully feeling optimistic and encouraged about the opportunities out there, really go and seek out what is available, what organizations in your industry have out there. Look at different things that the, Illinois Farm Bureau is offering. Look at what the National Pork Board is offering. Find those avenues to start getting some of this data really quantified and get those baselines so that you can continue to grow and prove that growth through your stories.
Jenny?
I would agree. I think Illinois Farm Bureau will continue to explore different educational programs and things that we can provide, whether that be as we start to talk more about carbon intensity scoring and things. There's all sorts of different calculators out there. I'm sure it's really difficult for farmers to navigate what to use and what not to. It might be university research. It might be, some kind of sustainable agriculture group that has a calculator. And so that's definitely hard to navigate. But I think that's something that we hope to do to support our members in the future to get that baseline and kind of know where they're at now, what they have, to show for their work if they've been doing some of these practices for years. And it never hurts to kind of take a look at, where they're at now and where they can improve or want to improve or what they're doing well and want to continue to maybe expand onto more acres.
I kind of know this answer, but my final question for you guys, I don't think you have bad days doing this advocacy work, do you?
There's a lot of great days. There's a lot of days where you put on your champion hat and you go out there and you do the best that you can for farmers. And I know that Jenny feels the same way, that's the best job in the world. When you can go out there and you can advocate for an industry that is near and dear to your heart. You're right. I mean, are there tough days? Absolutely. But are there bad ones? I don't think so.
I think there's days that a lot of them feel like great days. I think the most difficult thing about what we do is that we can't really prove what we do. Mm-hmm. There's, jobs I've had before, it's more of a task-based, thing where okay, I planned that conference, check that off the list, or I did that program, check it off the list. And that's not how these jobs work at all. With building relationships, something might come in handy later on, somebody you met at a conference or whatever, but it's really hard to prove what we do. And that doesn't make any of these days, less great. It just, sometimes it's hard to feel like you're moving the needle in these roles, but I think the more we keep working and the more we keep, having conversations like this out in the industry, the better off we'll be. And it's definitely a rewarding thing to do.
Thank you both for what you do and for being here on Taking Stock with Illinois Farm Bureau. Jill Brokaw, Business Development Specialist, EOC Environmental, and Jenny Webb, Associate Director of Industry Affairs, Illinois Farm Bureau.